Alright. Welcome to Sideboard MTG. My name's Eric, and it's time for another State of Standard. My weekly vlog where I go over, what's going on in Standard this week. Now, I do put my cards in order, or my decks in order, but don't rely too much on that. I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about tier this week. And our meta is just really unsolved, so it's really hard to say what is tier and what isn't tier. But I am going to try to at least lay that out in a top 4 decks, and then the next tier down from there and such. We've got a couple honorable mentions, got a lot to go over, and there's actually a whole lot I want to talk about. So if you like these State of Standard videos, give it a thumbs up. If you like the content in general, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Alright, let's talk a little bit about our cards this week. Now, a couple of the cards haven't really changed. Last week I talked about Vraska's Contempt and the Scarab God and Hazoret, and there was an honorable mention last week of Rekindling Phoenix. However, this week I've got no honorable mentions, as I really want to talk about the 6 cards in front of us here. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about here is Vraska's Contempt. Now, we've got Vraska's Contempt pulled up because it has become the most valuable piece of removal in Standard right now. And that's not necessarily because of the card itself being so good. 4 mana, instant speed to remove something is normally not what we're looking for, especially in the last set we had like Grasp of Darkness for 2 mana that removed most things that we need this for. However, this does hit the Scarab God and things like that, and most of you know that the Scarab God is a 5/5, so a Grasp of Darkness would not do that, and being able to answer it with 4 mana is a really good effect, and so good that you see like 3 and 4 copies of this deck being put on put on display, basically. Like, every deck that has black right now is running 3 to 4 copies of this. It's ridiculous, and the meta is evolving into how you can tax their copies of Vraska's Contempt, exactly like I said last week, and it's no different this week. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to talk about some of these decks that are coming up. A lot of people it's pretty much just straightforward that the top 3 decks right now. And probably the top deck is probably the most flexible of all the decks, which is great yet dangerous, and it just really matters about just how refined your palette is when looking at a deck. And we know from past experience with the recent bannings that pretty much everything was called Teamer Energy if it had a Tune and Rogue Refiner in it. So I think everyone's pretty much going to say the same about Grixis, because even though there's like 4 different versions of Grixis floating around right now, I think most people are just going to classify it as 2 different versions, and maybe even just one, just flat out it's Grixis Energy and be done with it, where there's really a mid-range and a control deck going around, and then there's the other few versions of it going around. You have the Infinite Thopters combo, and then there's the Grixis Improvise floating around, and these are all really separate decks. However, all of them use energy, and all of them use it to some great effect, and it looks like Grixis has become the final energy deck. Now, Rekindling Phoenix hasn't really shown up much in Grixis. However, if the Grixis mirror match becomes a thing, Rekindling Phoenix will start showing up, and I wouldn't even be surprised if Grixis didn't start squeezing in a 1 or a 2 of copy of Walking Ballista to help deal with this, as Rekindling Phoenix, it's kind of hard to deal with, and if you don't have your Vraska's Contempts to deal with it, or if you use your Vraska's Contempts on it, then you may not have Vraska's Contempts to deal with the Scarab God or other creatures. So I would expect Rekindling Phoenix to start getting a little bit of play in Grixis. I personally think that it might be better than Whirler Virtuoso in the current Standard. Even though it does come out on a turn 4, I do think that the card is really good. Now, that is kind of the backbone of what's going on in Standard. However, there are a couple other little things coming up, and in those, it's Magma Spray and a Braid. Now we're starting to see a lot more Abrade being played in main boards. Almost every Grixis deck has at least 3 copies in the 75 somewhere. Most play like 1, maybe 2 main board, and then the others in the sideboard. But there's always a good way to deal with artifacts, and that's because the Mardu Vehicles deck is becoming extremely powerful again, and it hasn't gotten any real new cards. The deck is just, it was a tier 1 deck before Temur Energy, and I have to say that it is at least a tier 1 deck now, as you can't really look at the team constructed list, and Mardu Vehicles has the most top 16 finishes in the past 3 weeks, so it has the most repeat performances, even over Ramunap Red. Now, if you do clump all of those Grixis decks together, you will receive a higher number in the Grixis percentages, but that is only if you clump all of those Grixis decks together. If you separate them out as Grixis Energy, or Grixis Midrange, Grixis Control, Improvise, then at that point, there is a different deck there, or they're not quite the same amount of numbers, but we are still seeing a lot of Abrade play, and this has really pushed Godpharaoh's Gift completely out of the meta. We have yet to see a top 8 from Godpharaoh's Gift in a plain standard event. Now, team constructed, I'm not counting that, as you know, the other decks can help those decks get to the top. So I'm not counting team constructed, and you'll notice that I even have the Constrictor deck listed as the 10th deck in standard. Now, why is that? That's because my number 1 deck in standard right now is the Grixis Energy deck. What? Where's my Grixis Energy? There it is. The Grixis Energy deck. Now, this is the version of it that came in the highest place not Pro Tour weekend, but the weekend before that, and it ran the Shielded Aether Thief, 4 Whirler of Virtuosos, Champion of Wits, all of these things, 3 copies of Vraska's Contempt. Now, the Whirler of Virtuoso, as the meta shifts, this is the card that is going to fluctuate in and out of the deck. You do see a couple copies of the Dusk Legion Zealot here. I don't know exactly how big of a fan of this I am, but it does give you that extra turn 2, let's just draw a card, have a blocker here, which is really good. I think the same can be said about Shielded Aether Thief. You can really turn the 3 mana or the 3 energy from a Whirler Virtuoso into a card instantly. Like, it enters the battlefield, they go to remove the Whirler in response to the trigger. You go ahead and resolve the trigger, and you get your card from your Shielded Aether Thief. So I really did like this, and even though I took Whirler out in my version of the deck, I definitely think that Whirler Virtuoso, if you're running the Shielded Aether Thieves and the Gifted Aether, or the Glint Sleeve Siphoners and that sort of thing, then Whirler has definitely got a place in the deck. But I do think it is a version that is going to shift. Now, that is one of the things that makes Grixis just so good, is because it has the power to shift. We have all of the best removal, all of the best threats, and it can pressure other decks while holding pressure off, which is extremely powerful. All of the interactions can leech off of each other. So, and what I mean by that is you can have a Glint Sleeve Siphoner and realize that you're against a blue-white control deck, and untap with 1 energy, trigger on the stack, go ahead and burn your Harness Lightning, which at that point you know you don't need Harness Lightning, so you could burn your Harness Lightning into your Glint Sleeve Siphoner and then just draw your cards right there. So again, we get to use that really powerful energy mechanic, and I think this is probably the best way to use it. This deck was really good even when Temur Energy was in the format, and you've seen Temur Energy actually become 4-color to make use of how good black was. Here we've just lost the green, and I actually think it helps a lot. So one of the things that makes this deck so powerful is its beautiful land base. Now, the land base is absolutely supreme here, and that's because you have both Canyon Slough and you have Fetid Pools. Now, you'll see that this particular copy of Grixis is shifted for double red. Now, all of the versions of Grixis will almost always have the double black backbone, but it is very easy to just shift a couple copies of your Fetid Pools or your Canyon Sloughs, along with a copy or two of your Drowned Catacombs and your Dragon Skull Summits, to give yourself a double blue shift if you want to go into the control side of things, or the double red shift if you want to go into the mid-range side of things. Now, most of the time we do see the Grixis mid-range be a little bit more on the double red side, and you can use that to kind of help decipher which of the versions of Grixis you're playing against. If they're playing a lot of blue lands, it's more likely that they are on the control path, that they are on that side of things. If they're playing, you know, more of the red lands, then it's more likely that they're trying to double red for Chandra, Glorybringer, things of that nature. So now you can't always rely on that. It is really luck of the draw, but it is something to look out for. You know, if they are, you know, playing a lot of red, then you can identify that they're more than likely either having a bad draw or they're actually on the Grixis mid-range list. Now, we'll cover the Grixis control list here in just a moment, as I've got that a little bit further down the list. However, I do believe that... Oh, someone just subscribed. Well, thank you for subscribing. I don't have my alerts up when I'm just recording, but thank you anyway. Anyway, the... Whirler Virtuoso, I definitely, you know, keep an eye out on how many copies of this are being run, but for the most part, the deck is extremely versatile, and it is 100% the deck that I would put people on if they had, you know, no worries about budget. The deck is extremely expensive, most of the time coming in upwards of $300 to $400, depending on how many copies of Chandra Torch of Defiance, how many copies of the Scarab God, Glorybringer, things of that nature you run. Now, the deck is expensive, but the deck is extremely powerful, and in my opinion, the best deck in the format. And with its ability to shift, I do not think it's going anywhere anytime soon. So, Grixis Energy, absolutely terrific deck and top of the format. Now, it's no question that the second best deck in the format is Mono Red. Now, we all know Mono Red. And Mono Red has started adapting, you know, cards like Magma Spray, Invigorating Rampage, things like that to help fight against what I've got as the third best deck in the format, and that's, you know, the Mardu Vehicles deck. Now, you'll still see that, you know, Mono Red has brought in Abrades from the sideboard. Now, this was normally a no-no, as you didn't want, you know, cards that could be dead in your hand when you're playing a Hazoret deck. However, in this case, it has become so volatile that you have to have an answer for an artifact, and most decks do have some type of artifact that Abrade is back in the main deck. And we did see that shift go away for a little while, and I think if we start to see less Mardu Vehicles or less Godpharaoh's Gift, then, which we've almost seen no Godpharaoh's Gift as of right now, but if we start to see more of it, then the Abrades will stay main board. The less Mardu Vehicles, the less Godpharaoh's Gift that we do see, those will... these Abrades will start to shift back into the sideboard, and I would expect to see the two sideboard Invigorating Rampages to start taking their place. Now, other than that, Red deck hasn't changed a whole lot. The Invigorating Rampage is really, really good. The deck does not have the Desert package that it used to. However, it does still run, you know, of course, the Sun-Scorched Deserts and Scavenger Grounds and things of that nature. So you do still have a little bit of an option there for, you know, a couple desert synergies. But for the most part, you're not going to be running like Desert FTK or anything like that. And, you know, most of these decks have adopted to either a Glorybringer or a Chandra main board. Now, normally we've seen this in the sideboard, but it seems that Red deck is starting to take a slightly more controlling approach and going farther into the mid-game. And we see that with 22 to 24 lands in some of these decks. So, it's not unheard of. Red deck is not going anywhere. It is definitely here to stay. Yes, it lost Rampaging Ferocidon. And yes, there is the Blue-White Eternalized deck that I actually think is extremely well placed in the meta right now, as there are a lot of decks that just have to kill you quick. If you start gaining life on them, there's not a lot that they can do. If you can start building a board presence, there's also not a lot they can do. Like this red deck, if you can deal with, say, things like Bomat Courier, then at that point they're living off the top of their library. If you were able to stabilize and then start gaining life, you'll normally beat these red decks. And that can be said for the mono black deck, the red black deck, or the black red deck. And if you watch last week's video, I covered all of those decks, as they're all kind of different variations of Hazoret decks. They're either different variations of mono red or different variations of the Mardu vehicles list, kind of dropping white. A lot of those decks do have the vehicles, and I do like the black splashed in them because you get to start picking up things like Scrap Heap Scrounger, which means that now you're in a better spot to pick up Heart of Kirin, which will tax your opponent's braids and things like that. So it's something to think about. I definitely think these Hazoret decks are top tier. So be on the lookout for those. I wouldn't say that mono red is the only one that's great. We see versions of this in the red white path deck. However, we haven't seen any versions of the red white path top 8 yet, or top 16, which is a little bit worrisome. Is the enchantment itself just too clunky to fit in these decks? And I mean, like, is that what's going on here? Is it just better to splash black for the Scrap Heap Scrounger and the Heart of Kirin's? Is that the best route to go? And I think time's going to tell a little bit, but honestly, I think the splash for black, I think we're really going to see the mono red. If people want to really push mono red, I think we're going to see maybe less Kari Zevs, things of that nature, and we're going to start seeing a little bit more splashing black. We're going to see a little bit more Scrap Heap Scroungers, which will increase how many magma sprays and such we need. At the beginning I was talking about magma spray and a braid being magma spray, a braid, and Vraska's Contempt being important pieces of removal right now. And it's very strange that we're not talking about Fatal Push, but everyone knows how good Fatal Push is. And some of the decks that are winning right now are actually foregoing Fatal Push altogether for more powerful options, as the format does seem to be slowing down a little bit. Now, as the format slows down, you're going to have red deck keep the format in check, so it can't slow down too much. Otherwise, red deck just comes in and does red deck things, which is winning. All right, now the third deck I do have here is the Mardu vehicles list. Now, again, this is a Hazoret list. However, it gets to make up a little bit of that reach here with Unlicensed Disintegration. We've got Heart of Kirin's. We've got main board Aethersphere Harvesters. Veteran Motorist. It's good, but the 1 power, it's really, really easy to kill. And remember, we are starting to see an influx of Walking Ballistas getting play. Now, I know a lot of people are playing the Constrictor list, and when there's a lot of Walking Ballistas in there, I don't personally recommend the Constrictor list right now, as I think the Constrictor list, as powerful as it is, has such a bad matchup to the #1 deck in the format, which is Grixis Energy, that the Constrictor list is kind of on the bottom of the powerful deck stack, and that's kind of why I've got it down as my number 10. Now, as of yet, like Approach, the Constrictor list has yet to put up a top 8 or a top 16 finish in a standard event. Now, Team Constructed event, yes, we had a Sultai Constrictor list win a Team Constructed 2 weeks ago. We had a couple green-black lists pop up in the Team Constructed events, but nothing in the solo standard events. So, absolutely nothing there. And I think it's got a lot to do with the fact that they can't get past the blockers. They can't get past all of the removal that Grixis has. And I think as long as Grixis is a top-tier deck, that the green-white Constrictor list is going to be my last go-to for a deck. Like, I can't go for anything that revolves around having synergy, because Grixis can just pick apart your best synergizing pieces, whether they are artifacts or creatures, or if they're just countering something from your hand. So enchantments are the best way to beat Grixis, and that's gonna that's going to be something that people are going to have to really pay attention to moving forward. And I think that Profane Procession and things like that, those type of cards are really going to start to see some play, as they do allow you to, once you get them down, you can just really deal with these Grixis Control and Grixis Energy decks. So Profane Procession and those and cards of that nature, I think that's going to be, you know, kind of where we see, you know, the answers for Grixis go. But this Mardu list here, as long as we continue to keep Abrades in the main board, we might be able to hold this deck back. But this is by far a Tier 1 deck. Do not mistake the fact that this is a Tier 1 deck. It was Tier 1 before Teamer Energy. As soon as Teamer Energy was gone, we seen Mardu vehicles back in the meta that, unless Grixis can hold down the Mardu vehicles list, we are not going to see this deck go anywhere anytime soon. Now, again, you know, the Mardu vehicles list is a lot like the Mono Red aggro list as far as being a hazard deck. It does have a couple other pieces of reach. You can kill, you know, Galtas and things like that. That's something that a red deck is probably not going to be able to do. You just kind of got to outrun those. Whereas here, you know, you do have that instant speed, unlicensed disintegration, and things like that. You also have a really good start here with a Toolcraft Exemplar into, say, a Heart of Kirin and things like that. Being able to scry and fix your draws is great. However, there's just no more draw power in this deck other than the Bomat Courier in the main deck. Again, thank you for subscribing. I might have to turn my alerts on so people that subscribe during videos can get shout outs. Either way, we're going to move on down to number 4. Now, number 4 I have put as green-red monsters, but it's technically a Jun list, as this is another Heart of Kirin Scrap Heap Scrounger deck. But you'll notice 4 main board Abrades. I have begged for, you know, Thrashing Brontodon or the beloved Brontodon to be in this deck, and we just haven't seen it. It just hasn't shown up. We've seen this deck show up in multiple copies, you know, week 1 and week 2 of Star City games. So Dallas and Philadelphia, we've seen this deck show up in almost a verbatim 75. I think that like maybe 3 cards were changed in the entire 75, and it makes sense. You know, that the deck is really, really good. It's kind of like the old Jun Gods list. However, there's just no Ronus. I mean, there's just no Hazard. Here it uses Ronus, Jade Light Ranger, Deathgorge Scavenger. I mean, you can play Deathgorge Scavenger, eat a non-creature spell out, and then attack with Ronus. But for the most part, it is a Heart of Kirin deck, including the fact that the only reason that it really splashes black is Scrap Heap Scrounger. Now, personally, I would love to see some unlicensed disintegration in the deck, but it just pretty much gets by with, you know, the 4 and 4 of Glorybringer, and I covered that last week. So there's not really a lot of new innovations with this deck. We haven't seen anything new come out of this deck. This is supposed to be the Daredevil, and the Daredevil in the sideboard of these decks has been really cool. I like it when I play the Daredevil here. And every time I pull this up from Star City Games, it has the wrong card there. The Mono Black had like some Night Watch Aeronaut or whatever. So that is something to look out for when you're pulling decks from Star City Games or some of the other. That not all of the lists are perfect. Now, if you guys want a link to any of these lists, I'm going to send a link to the Manatraders top decks, so you guys can just flip through there and see all the top decks in any given category, and I think it's a really good feature. But anyway, the whole point of this deck is to just hit a curve. So I mean, you're just trying to play the most powerful thing per turn that you possibly can. Now granted, turn 1 is a little bit weak, and that is because they wanted more powerful cards turn 3, 4, and 5. And from that point, you know, after turn 3, 4, and 5, you start trying to play multiple spells per turn, or even multiple spells per turn starting as early as turn 4. So you know, a lot of interaction here. It is a good deck for, you know, just running out your curve. It does have some good removal in Magma Spray and Abrade. Has a few good creatures. I'm not 100% sold on Merfolk Branchwalker, but you can get your +1/1 counter and crew your Heart of Kirin. Other than that, we've seen this deck kind of drop a couple of the cute cards that it had in its original creation, like Atali and Galta and things like that, just for more Rekindling Phoenixes, Glory Bringers, and things of that nature, which do task Vraska's Contempt. Now, one thing I do want to warn about Ronus: Baffling End is starting to get more play. Baffling End deals with Ronus just extremely easily. So if Baffling End continues to get more play, I don't know how good Ronus is going to be. But the meta will have to start to shift more white for that to happen. And it could happen. The meta may start to shift white, as we're already seeing, performances out of blue-white in both the Eternalized deck here. We had blue-white auras, which has also had a little bit, and I definitely should have honorable mentioned Jim Davis's blue-white auras deck. I am going to honorable mention a few decks here at the end, and I do think that the blue-white auras deck is one of the better decks in the format right now. I know a lot of people are not playing it. Why do I have it already up there? All right. I know a lot of people are not playing it right now, but the Anointed Procession and Sunscourge Champion is just absolutely phenomenal. Gaining 8 life when you're bringing this back from the battlefield, and you can do that as early as turn 5. Gaining 8 life here is just absolutely terrific. If you start getting down multiple copies of Anointed Procession, you're starting to do things that not really even God Pharaoh's Gift does. Now, God Pharaoh's Gift, yes, they can do them earlier and can do certain other things, but this deck is extremely powerful and should not go underlooked. I do want to let you guys know that if you're wanting to play a deck that has good sources of life gain, this might be one of the better ways to do it. And it's just simply an Bomb Eternalized deck. You have a lot of Eternalized effects here, whether you're bringing back aggressive creatures, defensive creatures, if you just need to deal with things, or you just need to find more answers. There are tons of answers in this deck. You have you can bring back multiple copies of Cast Out in the form of this Angel. You can just simply wipe the board with your Fumigates and things of that nature. The deck is extremely versatile, has the best piece of artifact removal or the graveyard hate in the game for its strategy. I don't think that you could have a better piece for your own strategy. Now, in other decks, yeah, there's probably much better pieces you could use, but this will shut down the Scarab God. This will shut down a lot of the other decks that use graveyard mechanics. However, it will not shut you down. Now, you do have to still worry about, say, Grixis Energy, eternalizing a Champion of Wits so that they can eventually get rid of your Gravestone, but until then, the Scarab God is not targeting anything, and you can just deal with everything plus draw a card. That is not bad. So it is something to look for here. The sideboard is really cheap. This is reminiscent of a Jim Davis deck right here with really cheap interactions in the sideboard, Spell Pierce, things of that nature. I think the deck is extremely strong and well placed in the meta. The ability to gain life that it has is just terrific and cannot be overlooked. Now, next we're going to move into the other side of Grixis. Now, here you'll see that this particular version of Grixis Control has a much deeper shift into the blue, which I did speak of earlier. It does still have a very healthy shift into black, which is very standard. It's very common to see that. Now, you won't see as much energy in this particular version, and you'll see a lot more mainboard counter. And that's because this truly is a control deck. Now, Grixis doesn't have a lot of really good answers for things like enchantments. We'll just keep using the example of Profane Procession, but they do have Consign to Oblivion. Now, Consign will return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then if it does come back, it would then be a new permanent, so things exiled before with it, they wouldn't be able to flip and bring it back or something like that. So also the other half of this Oblivion would make them discard 2 cards, so you can end of turn bounce something and possibly make them discard it, so that you can just, you know, be done with it altogether. You will notice that there are 3 copies of Vraska's Contempt in the deck, along with a number of other really good removal spells, including Counter. Also, it runs, you know, the Scarab God, it runs Torrential Gearhulk. The deck is extremely powerful. The Scarab God, Torrential Gearhulk with a ton of instants is a really, really good deck. And if you can control the game long enough to start resolving things like Nicol Bolas, and it doesn't die to your opponent's copy of Vraska's Contempt, then at that point, your Nicol Bolas would pretty much just take over the game. And that's why, you know, Grixis is just a great deck to put people on, whether you're a mid-range player or you're a control player. We're starting to see finishes here. And remember, last week we only had 3 decks that put up repeat performances in the standard event. That was the Grixis control deck, the Mardu Vehicles deck, and the Grixis mid-range deck. Not even Red deck put up a multiple copies in the top 16 of Star City Philly. So that is something to look at. And there were 0 copies of Approach. There were 0 copies of Green-White Constrictor, or Black-White Constrictor, or Black-Green Constrictor, Sultai Constrictor. There were 0 Constrictors in the top 16. And yet we had multiple copies of Grixis, multiple copies of Grixis Energy, Control. We had Grixis Improvise. We had Grixis everything. And what all of that does, now, granted, I believe that a lot of this red removal is 100% necessary, mainly the Abrades, to be able to deal with the meta, but the backbone of this entire deck comes from my 8th place deck. And that is just a pure Grixis or blue-black mid-range, blue-black control build. Now, there's blue-black control that, you know, Tamada won U.S. Nationals with, which, you know, you got, you know, disallows galore in there. You have ways to answer with Approach. I do think that Approach might be Grixis Energy's main weakness, as you pretty much just win game 1 with Approach if it's against Grixis Energy. If it's against Grixis Control, you may or may not win that. But in blue-black here, you've got a little bit of both worlds. You've got all of the Vraska's Contempt you could want. You've got the Scarab Gods, Torrential Gearhulks. You don't have the red removal. You got some draw plan here in your treasure maps, main board glint sleeve siphoners, champion of wits. The deck can really draw through to get its powerful spells like Fatal Push, Spell Pierce, Essence Scatter, main board negate. Now this is not something we normally see, but having main board negate just gives you that edge versus Approach. Also, Spell Pierce. A lot of times Approach decks, especially if you get down a Glint Sleeve Siphoner or something like that early, can follow that up with yet another creature like a Champion of Wits or something, and can just continue to crash in. You're doing a lot of damage, and Spell Pierce can help you hold off Fumigates that are timely settle the wreckages. If they are trying to cast their Approach on turn, you can counter that, things like that. There's just a lot of really good room for Spell Pierce right now. I personally run it in my Grixis deck, and I even got the lovely chance to counter a Nicol Bolas for 1 mana, and that was fun, you know, playing in the Grixis control mirror there. So Spell Pierce, definitely one that I would like for you guys to keep an eye out for. Spell Pierce is definitely a card that is going to help you fight back against Vraska's Contempt. Moving on down, though, we do have a Jund mid-range list. Now, we're starting to see a little bit of this, and it's kind of where Tamer Energy kind of flew off to. Like, there's not a lot of Tamer Energy left. There's not a lot of that idea. The 4-color energy decks that were floating around, the Jund mid-range list here is a lot like the green-red monsters deck. However, it does go a little bit heavier on black, and that is because it wants to be able to cast Vraska's Contempt. Now, again, I talked about Vraska's Contempt quite a bit earlier, so I'm not going to continue to just pound Vraska's Contempt into your guys' head. But remember, everything's about being able to exile the Scarab God, Hazoret, those powerful threats. And the rest of the meta is based around putting these powerful threats down to get your opponent's Vraska's Contempts out of hand. So if you can't deal with those powerful threats in your own way, then you're definitely going to get run over by most of the meta right now. Now, Jadelight Ranger is not exactly one of those threats that you just have to answer with a Vraska's Contempt. Most of the time you can just magma spray this with the triggers on the stack. Don't even worry about it. Let them get their lands if that's what's going to happen, or they can just dump some stuff in the graveyard, show you a few cards, that sort of thing. For the most part here though, Jadelight Ranger is the curve filler. It keeps you, on track for hitting your lands. Now, this deck does run 26 lands, which is just absurd for me. Like, to just think of this deck just hitting these lands non-stop, but it is because they have a high end here. They're trying to get to these Walking Ballistas, which is really, really good. I think that the deck may start to adapt more to Rekindling Phoenix than it will to some of these Gontis or other things like that. I think that the deck can really cast Rekindling Phoenix, but we do have double green, double red, double black in this deck, and that's why it is so far down on the list. Even though we've seen a couple good top 8 finishes, top 16 finishes from this deck, I just don't really know how much I could trust the land base to give me double green on 3, double black on 4, and then double red on 5. I don't know how much I could trust a land base like that. However, when you do have land bases like that, I do like having things like Walking Ballista. I like having things like Scrap Heap Scrounger that I can squeeze in when I have those awkward land bases. So that is one of the things that does make this deck a little bit more appealing. And now that'll bring us on into what I think is the best worst deck in Standard. And it hurt me to put this deck all the way down in 10th place and at the bottom of my list. It does go above the honorable mentions. Approach is in the honorable mentions. Auras is even in the honorable mentions, even though Auras has had a top 8 finish. Constrictor, as long as Grixis Energy is setting in number 1, Constrictor will be the best deck setting on the sidelines. Think Mardu Vehicles while Temur Energy was in the format. As long as Temur Energy was in the format, Mardu Vehicles was just sitting in the back, in the sidelines, waiting for its moment to strike. And occasionally it would strike and take down a tournament as people shifted to braids and things like that. You would see Mardu Vehicles kind of squeeze in there and get something. And I think this entire Rivals of Ixalan, I believe that Constrictor is going to be that deck. I think Constrictor is going to be the deck that sneaks in, spikes a tournament, spikes a GP, that we're going to see that finish from it. But as long as Grixis Energy is in the format, I don't think that we're going to see a healthy supply of this deck. And I think that we're going to see the players notice the same thing I have. Unfortunately, I can't back the Winding Constrictor right now, as it requires too much synergy, too much setup to really get rolling. Now, I do know that with the lack of Confiscation Coup in Standard, that it is much safer to start bringing Inverter Skier Hulk and cards like this. Before, it was a little bit more dangerous, as they could easily hostage taker this away, do other things. However, most of the time against Grixis Energy, you're going to be playing this as an 8/8 with trample to get abraded. That's just how I feel about it. I think that's what's going to happen. It'll either get abraded, or you're just going to get it Vraska's Contempt, and that'll be the end of it. Now, this deck does have a lot of tools to fight back. You're in the the green-black colors, so you have all the great removal of green. You have all the great removal of black, and then the big healthy creatures of green. A lot of synergy in this deck. The deck will pilot very, very well. I just don't think that the spells line up very good against Grixis Energy. Now, I could be wrong, and there may be a version of this that comes out that is more suited to fight Grixis Energy, and if that does happen, then the Constrictor list will go higher up on my priority list as far as decks to really watch out for and to be aware of. Now, that was the last of my top 10 here. I'm gonna talk a little bit about my honorable mentions, and my first honorable mention is going to be Jim Davis's approach list. And honestly, I really mean any green-white approach list. If you're running the version of approach that runs Hour of Promise and Approach of the Second Sun, then this is kind of the category I'm talking about. Now, I tried a Bant, and I've tried Naya, and I've tried Abzant. Personally, I think the Bant list is the best of those as far as the ramp approach strategy. In the past, we've seen just the control approach strategy. We've seen the ramp approach strategy. We're starting to see the Masterminds acquisitions approach strategy, where it's kind of tricking approach into your hand or something like that. And then we also have the red-white approach strategy. So there's 4 different strategies you can take with the approach, which makes approach itself a very diverse card and a very diverse win con, and I think that is really, really good. However, as of right now, I don't think anyone has found the best Rivals of Ixalan version of approach. We had a lot of success with blue-white approach, and I don't think that blue-white approach by any means is gone. I just think that currently the main decks in Standard either get under the deck or they have answers to it, so it will be holding it back a little bit. Now, again, the more Grixis midrange becomes a thing, and the more people play Grixis midrange, the wider the door for approach is going to open, and then the more approach decks you're going to start to see, and then at that point I would highly expect to start seeing approach decks in the top 8, top 16 of major events. Until then, though, we'll see them in the undefeated top 5 or undefeated on MTGO and things like that. But for the most part, in the major events, I think they're just going to get squashed out by some of these faster decks that Grixis Energy is really built to fight. So as long as the aggro decks are keeping approach down, Grixis Energy will do well. As Grixis Energy starts to push back on the aggro decks, approach will start to do better. So I think that's going to be our cycle for Rivals of Ixalan, and I think that's basically what we've really got to worry about here. Now, there's some other little strategies here that you don't actually have to take. You don't have to go mono red to have that tier 1 really powerful attacking deck. If you don't want to go the white for Mardu vehicles, and this is why I say mono red and Mardu vehicles are so powerful, because you can have a deck that kind of splits the difference between the two. And technically, this black-red aggro here is a mix of 3 different decks. It's a mix of mono red, it's a mix of mono black, and a mix of Mardu vehicles all in one. And that is that's quite interesting. So I like the deck, and it shows the flexibility in Standard right now. With if you can take versions of top tier decks and pilot them well, then you stand a really good chance. So really separating the power level between one of these top decks all the way down to our honorable mentions, I think the power difference between those right now is very, very slim. You're looking at just one top deck away from it being a flip back in the other direction, or a top deck into flipping things back for you. So, and that goes with pretty much any deck, as long as it's running proper packages. And there's just so many good cards in Standard right now that you can build competitive decks, and you can build those pretty much to your preference of play, and that makes Standard a really, really healthy place to be right now. So I think that that's absolutely terrific. I do want to touch on this mono black aggro deck here. Now, I personally ran a version that is pretty close to this yesterday. I didn't run the 4 of Amen Eternals, a couple other really small changes, but for the most part, this deck is very, very good. I like the deck. I think that it's extremely well suited. It is one of those decks where if they start gaining life, you've just lost. It's over. You know, the chances of you coming back from it are extremely slim. But I do have to mention Bone Picker, and if you follow the Pro Tours and things like that, you'll know that Calcano ran a version of Green Black in the past that had Bone Picker in it with 4 copies of Fatal Push, 4 copies of Bone Picker, and he did really well. And I think that we might have to see something like that come back to standard before we really see the green-black deck start to rise again. But I do want you guys to be aware of just how good Bone Picker is in the current meta. You're getting around Fatal Push. You're not getting around the Abrades and things like that. But Bone Picker is extremely powerful, especially if you're running Heart of Kirin decks and things like that. Just absolutely... I can't say more good things about Bone Picker. It is just a terrific deck, or a terrific card in this strategy. I think the mono black strategy is probably the #1 budget strategy for yet another set in a row. So if you're looking for the the most competitive under $100 deck you can find, that's going to be the mono black. Yeah, like straight up, I have to tell you guys, if you want an extremely competitive deck that is extremely aggro, then go with mono black. That's budget. Now, if you want a budget deck that is a little bit trickier, has a little bit more complex lines, even though mono black has some pretty complex lines, just knowing when you should get in for that extra point of damage, the blue-white auras deck that was built by Jim Davis. I had 2 Jim Davis decks in my honorable mentions here, guys. The guy is a great deck builder, and if you don't know who he is, check him out. But Jim Davis also brought us this deck, and he did take it to a 3rd place finish in Star City Dallas constructed event, the standard constructed event. So if you guys are interested in, a standard Boggles deck and the lines and things that come with that, even though this deck is a standard Boggles deck and it doesn't have a ton of creatures, 19 creatures, it doesn't have a ton of creatures. It plays a lot like Tempo. It has the ability to draw cards. It has the ability to give your creatures some evasion and things like that. I really, really like this deck. It surprised me at how well the deck even turns on Ascend for, Sky Marcher Aspirant and things like that. The deck has the means to go into the late game, but it also has the means to just take someone out very, very early. So I definitely have to throw out an honorable mention to Jim Davis and his list here. Other than that, I probably want to throw one other honorable mention that hasn't really given a top 8 finish, but that's going to be our Devs deck that we played this week. I actually think that the Rakdos Control deck that Dev built earlier this week is suited to be one of the more powerful decks in Standard. Now, you might want to make a couple small changes to it, but Dev put together an extremely powerful deck. So, definitely my last honorable mention here is going to be Dev's Rakdos Control. It has all the tools needed to fight against the meta. It has enough power to tax your opponent's Vraska's Contempts. I do think that the deck needs at least one more copy of Vraska's Contempt, possibly another copy of Treasure Map. And as far as Doomfall goes, maybe Vona's Hunger, but Doomfall is actually a really good card too. So I do think that the deck is extremely powerful, and these Rakdos Control decks in a meta that is just trying to simply throw down their threat and have you answer it, you will have the answers with Rakdos Control. Alright guys, that is my thoughts on Standard as of right now. There's a lot of brewing, and the gap between the decks that I talked about and the gap and the next set of decks, which would cover so many different brews and ideas and things like that, the gap between the power of our most powerful decks and the power of some of our jank decks is not that huge. I don't think that, that it's just overpowering to say that you can't play a budget deck right now. We even have budget options of cards like Vraska's Contempt with Hour of Glory and things like that. So if you guys are looking for a new deck to play, there's a couple budget options here in the video. There's also a couple non-budget options. And I think that 100% I would have to say, if you're looking for something, you know, very spiky, competitive, you're not worrying about budget, go ahead and grab you that Grixis Energy deck. You'll be able to twist it and tweak it to your play style. I wouldn't over tweak it too much. You only got about 3 to 4 cards that you can play with. I'd play around in the Whirler Virtuoso area as the meta shifts, and you can really build that deck to your liking. I like it, and I think that the deck has absolutely all of the tools needed going through Rivals of Ixalan. So, Mono Black being the next deck that I would say is just absolutely terrific. If you want to go on a budget and you can't afford, you know, $300-400 for the Grixis deck, Mono Black would be the way to go. And then from there, if you didn't want the Mono Black, turn things a sideways thing, I would say that the Blue White Auras is a really good deck. Now the Blue White Auras deck could start getting, you know, a little bit more expensive as some of the other parts start to rise in price. But for the most part, Blue White or the Mono Black aggro deck, very powerful decks and in a pretty good price range. So guys, that was my episode of State of Standard. I hope you guys like it. Let me know in the comments whether you agree, disagree. I think that the most controversy is going to be the controversy over Green-Black Constrictor. If you guys have a better argument for Green-Black Constrictor, I would love to hear it. But as of right now, I really can't get behind the deck. I played it a couple times this weekend, and you know, I had Grixis Energy, and it just felt like such a good matchup for my Grixis Energy deck that I just can't give any faith to the Green-Black Constrictor list right now. I mean, I have the cards and paper and would love to build it, but I just don't think that Green-Black Constrictor has what it takes in a purely standard environment. Now, when people are worried about other things, then maybe Green-Black Constrictor might start to show up, but I think it'll be the sleeper deck that just kind of hides in the background and kind of pops up from time to time. It's a good deck. It is the best worst deck in Standard. Like, it is so good that it could easily be the best deck in Standard. However, there is just a really good answer that also answers most of the rest of the meta, and that's the Grixis Energy deck. So, again, as long as it's around, I think we're going to have some trouble. So, either way, let me know in the comments what you think about, you know, some of the things I've said, some of the things I've pointed out. Do you agree that Vraska's Contempt is directly taking over how we're playing the meta right now? Or is it actually because of the Scarab God? Why did we go from 1 copy of the Scarab God in Grixis decks to 2 and 3 copies of the Scarab God? We see the Sultai Snake decks that do well have 4 copies of the Scarab God in the deck. That's because they know that they cannot keep Synergy online by only casting those creatures 1 time. They're going to have to play those creatures, remove your opponent from having a hand, and then have the Scarab God to throw down and take over. So I think that's where the meta lies right now. That's how I feel about Green-Black Snake. Guys, I had a lot of fun talking about this stuff. I hope you guys had a lot of fun listening to it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll see you next time here on Sideboard MTG.